Chapter 20 of Green Valley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rex. Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds. Chapter 20 Christmas Bells. After the last bit of glory has faded from the autumn woods and the first snowfall comes to cover the tired fields, Green Valley, all snugly housed and winterproof, settles down to solid comfort and careful preparation for the two great winter festivals, Thanksgiving and Christmas. The question of whether the Thanksgiving dinner is to be eaten at home or whether we are going away for Thanksgiving has in all probability been settled long ago, for in Green Valley, Thanksgiving invitations begin to be exchanged and sent out to distant parts as early as July. That is, of course, if the matter of fact who's to go where had not already been settled the Thanksgiving before. In some families, the last rite of each Thanksgiving feast is to discuss this question and settle it then and there for the following year. Conservative and clannish families who live far enough apart so that little quarrels cannot be born among them to upset this fixed yearly program usually do this. The greater part of Green Valley, however, leaves itself absolutely free until sometime in August. By that time, though, the heat is so intense that stout, collarless men in shirt sleeves and searching about for some relief think gratefully of Thanksgiving and snowdrifts and ask their wives whom they are planning to have for the Thanksgiving. Why, maybe the answer. I hadn't thought of it yet, but I rather think Aunt Eleanor expects us this year. Well, answers the husband, all right. Only if you decide to go, don't forget to take along some of your own pumpkin pies. Your Aunt Eleanor's never quite suit me. I like considerable ginger in my pumpkin pies. Another husband may say, no sir, not on your life are we going to Jim's for Thanksgiving. That wife of his is much too young to know how to make just the right kind of turkey dressing, and I am too old to take chances on things like that now. Those pretty brides are apt to get so excited over their lace table dollies that they forget to put in the sage or onions, and there you are, one whole Thanksgiving day and the turkey spoiled forever. No sir, count me out. Sometimes wives say, we have been invited to 3 places, Jemmy, but let's stay home. When we go out, I always get white meat and I hate it. And I like my cranberries, hulls and all instead of just gel. It is just such little human-like notions that finally decide the matter, and so it was this year. Sam Bobbin's eldest sister was having Sam and his wife, because Sam spent so much money for his fighting roosters and he ain't got money for a Thanksgiving turkey. Dolly Beatty's mother was having Charlie Peters for Thanksgiving dinner and all the immediate relatives to pass the judgment on him. He had proposed and Dolly had accepted, but no announcement was to be made until all the Beattys and Dundries had had their say. Frank Burton and Jenny were going by train to Jenny's rich and haughty and painfully religious aunt in Cedar Point. All Jenny's sisters, even the one from Vermont, were to be there, and Jenny did want to go to visit with the girls. She and Frank had never been invited to any semi-religious festivals by this aunt, owing to Frank's atheistic tendencies. But the haughty and religious dame had heard rumors and was curious. I'll go for your sake, Jenny, but she'll be disappointed. Maybe I'd better shave my mustache so's to let her see some change in me. Of course, everybody who had a grandmother in the country was going to Grandma's, and early Thanksgiving morning, teams were arriving for the various batches of grandchildren. That was the only fault one could find with the Green Valley Thanksgiving, that so many went away to spend their day. But with Christmas, it was different. Christmas in Green Valley was a home day. The town was full of visitors and sleigh bells and merry calls and walking couples. Everybody was waving Christmas presents or wearing them. For Green Valley believed in Christmas presents, not the kind that make people awake nights hating Christmas and that call for do your shopping early signs, but the old-fashioned kind of presents that are not stained with hate or worry or debt. The giving of Christmas presents was the pleasantest kind of a game in Green Valley. Of course, everybody knew everybody's needs, so well that weeks before the gifts, wrapped in tissue paper, lay waiting in a trunk up in the attic. And as a general thing, everybody was happy over what they got. No present cost much money, but oh, what a world of thought and love and fun went into it. Nor was it hard for Green Valley folks to decide what to give. When Dell Parsons saw her dearest friends admiring her asparagus fern, she divided it in the fall and tended it carefully and sent it to Nan Turner on Christmas morning. When folks found out that sometime next spring Alice Sears might have a baby to dress, they sent her ever so many lovely, soft little things so she would not have to worry or grieve because her first baby could not have its share of pretties. As soon as Green Valley knew that Jocelyn Brownlee was engaged, it sent her a tried and true poor man's wife cookbook, big ginge ham aprons, holders to keep her away from burning her hands, and samples of their best jellies, pickles, and preserves. And such a time as Green Valley grandmothers had weaving, knitting, crocheting, beautiful rag rugs to match blue and white bathrooms, yellow and green kitchens, pink and cream bedrooms, and every year there was a large crop of home knitted mittens that Green Valley girls and boys wore with pride and comfort. No city pair of gloves ever equaled Grandma's knitted ones that went very nearly to the elbow and were the only thing for skating and coasting. Christmas was the time too when dreams came true. Fanny Foster knew this when Christmas morning she opened a parcel and found a beautiful silk petticoat. No card came with it, but Fanny knew. Hen Tomlins had a baby boy for his best Christmas gift. Agnes had always opposed all talks of adopting a baby, but this year that was her gift to Hen, and they were all happy about it. Of course, even in Green Valley, a certain amount of foolishness prevailed. Everybody smiled when a week before Christmas, Jessie Williams said she had all her presents ready but Earth hers, that she was waiting for next payday to get his, that she believed she'd get him a new pink silk lampshade, but she knew beforehand he wouldn't be pleased and would only say that he wished to heaven she'd let him have the money. Lutie Barlow was badly disappointed with the $150 Victrola her husband bought her. She said she wanted a red gown to match her Rhode Island reds. Perhaps no one in the Green Valley was so generously remembered as the young minister, but though every one of the many gifts that came pleased him, he was strangely unhappy and restless. Invitations, as usually, had poured in on him, but he had chosen to spend the day with Grandma Wentworth, and yet, though he was glad to be with her, his thoughts strayed off to a certain grey day in the fall when he ran down a hill with the girl's hand in his. He remembered the surge of joy that had rushed through him when he got her safely into his storm-proof house and banged shut the door on the stormy world without. He thought of the hour they spent in silence before the fire that roared exultantly as the storm tore with angry fingers at the doors and windows, that he now felt was the most perfect hour of his life. His mind was struggling to understand these memories, these strange new emotions. He had a queer feeling that something wonderful was waiting just outside his reach. Something was waiting for his recognition. He was standing in Grandma Wentworth's dining room, looking out the window at the winter landscape. Grandma was in the kitchen seeing to the dinner, for she was to have quite a party. Roger and David, Mrs. Brownlee and Jocelyn, Cynthia's son and his man Timothy. At least Cynthia's son watched the rest of the party coming through the little path that led to Grandma's door. He saw them all plainly through the curtains and plants that screened him. Jocelyn and David came last. David made a great to-do about stamping the snow off his feet, taking pains to stand between Jocelyn and the door. Then just as Jocelyn was about to slip past him, the minister saw David reach out and sweep the girl into his arms, and Cynthia's son could not help but see the glory in the boy's eyes as the girl's wild rose face turned up to meet her lover's kiss. For blind seconds, John Roger Churchill Knight crashed through space, and then the next minute he was living in a shining world that was all roses and skylarks and dew. He laughed, for all at once he knew what ailed him. He knew that the wonderful, tantalizing something that had so steadily eluded him, tormented him, was just Nan. the girl of the grey day, the log fire in the storm. He was the maddest, gladdest man in Green Valley that day until he remembered that he had sent Nan no gift, not even a greeting or a word of thanks for the beautiful collie dog she had sent him. He stood in horrified amazement at his stupidity. Jocelyn had been showing them her new ring, and Nan, his sweetheart, had not even a Christmas card. Cynthia's son went to the telephone, but even as he raised the receiver, he somehow guessed what the answer would be. Nan's father answered. "Why, John, she left on that 110 for Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's the first fool thing I have ever known her to do. Stayed right here till she'd given us our Christmas gifts and dinner, and then off she went to see this old aunt in Scranton. Why, yes, you can send a telegram. She'll get it when she arrives." So it happened that when a tired, homesick, wretched girl reached her aunt's house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, she found that one gift for which her heart had cried all that long Christmas day. It was just a bit of yellow paper that said, "Oh, grey day girl, don't stay too long. The fire is singing, your chair is waiting, and I have so much to tell you. Come home and forgive." End of chapter 20. Recording by Rex.
Chapter 21 of Green Valley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Renee Moore. Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds. Chapter 21. Fanny's Hour. Nobody had asked Fanny to be a member of the Civic League, but she was its most energetic promoter, its most zealous advocate. Never had she had such a cold weather opportunity. Fanny hated cold weather. It shut people up in houses, shut their mouths, their purses, their laughter. It made life grim and rather gray. Fanny loved sunshine and open sunny roads. She tried to do her duty in winter as well as in summer, but when the weather drops to 10 or 20 below, the sunniest of natures is bound to feel it. But this winter, Green Valley women were so stirred and roused that they thought of other things beside the price of coal and sugar and yarn. The short winter days fairly flew. The Civic League was young, but already it was laying out an ambitious spring program. No mere man was a member, but all the men had to do was to show a little attention to Fanny Foster to know what was going on. "We're going to set up a drinking fountain in the business square," Fanny explained. "The men of this town have the hotel, but the horses never did have a decent trough of clean water, and we're going to have a little low place fixed, so's the dogs can get a drink too. This is to prevent hydrophobia. We've already started the boys to building birdhouses, so's to have them ready to put up the first thing in the spring. There'll be less killing of songbirds with slingshots, though of course there's never been much of that done in Green Valley. Then that crossing at West End is going to be attended to. There's been enough rubbers lost in the mud hole to about fill it, so it won't take much to fill it up. We're going to have a little bridge built over that ditch on Lane Avenue, so's we women don't dislocate our joints jumping over it. But first the ditch is going to be deepened and cleaned, so's it won't smell so unhealthy. When that's done, the ladies aim to plant wildflowers along it, careless-like, to make it look as if God had made it instead of lazy men. We're going to suggest that all buildings in the business section put out window boxes. We'll furnish the flowers. It will give a distinctive note of beauty to the town." Fanny was carefully quoting Mrs. Brownlee. "Billy Evans' wife promised to see to it that Billy painted the livery barn, and there's a delegation of ladies appointed to wait on Mert Hagley and see if we can't get him to mend his sheds. They're so lopsided and rickety that Mrs. Brownlee says they're an eyesore and a menace to public safety. There's another delegation that's going to ask the saloon keeper to keep the basement door shut when the trains come in, so as to keep that beery and whiskey smell out of the streets as much as possible. while maybe visitors are walking about. We're going to send a special committee to see what the railroad will do about fixing up this old station, or, better still, giving us a new one and beautifying its grounds. We're planning to see Colonel Stratton about starting up a club for the preservation of our wildflowers, and Doc Phillips is to have charge of a fight on the moths and things that are eating and killing our fruit trees. The school buildings will be investigated and conditions noted. Doc Phillips says that if the heating plant and ventilation and light was tended to, we wouldn't have so much sickness among the children, or so many needing glasses. As soon as spring really comes, the Women's Civic League is going to start up a cleanup campaign. Of course, Green Valley never was a dirty town. Everybody likes to have their yard nice, but there's considerable old faded newspaper and rusty tin cans lying along the roads farther out and in unnoticed corners that nobody's felt responsible for. That will all be attended to. We'll have no filth, no germs, no ugliness anywhere, Mrs. Brownlee says. And I've been appointed a committee of one to wait on Seth Curtis and call his attention to the careless way he leaves his horses standing about the town. Those horses are dangerous and getting uglier in temper every day, and Seth is just as bad. This was only too true. Seth had grown bitter and even reckless of late. Ever since his quarrel with Ruth about Jim Tumley, Seth had been boiling with temper. Old poisons that had spoiled his life in many ways, and that he thought he had conquered, crept back to tyrannize over him. Poor Seth had had so much discipline in his youth that the least hint of pressure threw him into a state of vicious rebellion. Seth had a fine mind, could think quicker and straighter to the point than a good many Green Valley men, but when that mind was clouded with anger and stubbornness, Seth was a hopeless proposition. Ruth was his one star, and even she, Seth felt, had set herself against him. So Seth, who seldom had frequented the hotel, was there almost every day now when he should have been working. He even drank more than before. Not that he cared more for it, but it was his way of showing independence. So Seth was very ugly these days, and his horses suffered as they had never suffered before. They too were growing ugly and vicious, and so nervous that the least noise, the least stir, sent them into a quivering frenzy of fright. Everyone in Green Valley knew this, and not a few men and women were worrying. Several men were making up their minds to speak sharply to Seth about it. But everybody smiled and even felt relieved when they heard that Fanny had offered her services to the Civic League in this capacity. Green Valley knew Seth and knew Fanny Foster. Fanny would most certainly tell Seth about it, and everybody knew just how mad Seth would get. Fanny would not, of course, accomplish much, but she would open up the subject, suffer the first violence of Seth's anger, and so make it easier for some more competent person to take Seth to task and force him to be reasonable. The minister had spoken to Seth long ago, but though Seth listened quietly to the quiet words of the one man he had come to love in his queer fashion, he had set his jaw grimly at the end and said, "No, sir, I've made up my mind not to stand this interference with my personal liberty, and God himself can't budge me." "Yes, he can, Seth, but don't let it go that far," Cynthia's son had begged. Now all Green Valley was waiting to see Fanny tackle Seth in the name of the Civic League. It would be funny, everybody said. Fanny did it one sunny afternoon in early spring when the streets were gay with folks all out to taste the first bit of gladness in the air. Fanny did it in her usual lengthy and thorough manner and permitted no interruptions. She was talking for the first time in her life with authority vested in her by a civic body, so there was a strength and a conscientiousness about her remarks that struck home. Seth was standing alone on the hotel steps when Fanny began talking, but all of Green Valley that was abroad was gathered, laughingly, about her when she finished and stood waiting for Seth's answer. Seth had had a glass too much, or he would never have done, never have said what he did and said that day. He would never have taken poor, harmless, laughter-loving, happy-go-lucky Fanny Foster, who had never done a mean, malicious thing in her life, who had let her world use her for all the little hateful tasks that nobody else would do, and in which there was no thanks or any glory. Seth in his senses would never have held up this dear, though unfinished, soul to the scorn, the pitiless ridicule of her townsmen. If Fanny had been touched with fire and eloquence because she spoke with authority, Seth too talked with a bitter brilliance that won the crowd and held it against its will. With biting sarcasm and horrible accuracy, Seth drew a picture of Fanny as made Green Valley smile and laugh before it could catch itself and realize the cruelty of its laughter. Fanny stood at the foot of the wide flight of stairs like a criminal at the bar. As Seth's words grew more biting, his judgments more cruel, Fanny's face flushed with shame, then faded white with pain. But Seth went too far. He went so far that he couldn't stop himself, and the crowd who had gathered to hear a little harmless fun now stood petrified and heartsick. No one stirred, though everybody was wishing themselves miles away, and Seth's voice, dripping with cruelty, went on. Then all at once from the heart of the crowd a little figure pushed its way. It was Seth's wife, Ruth. She walked halfway up that flight of stairs and looked steadily at her husband. Seth stopped in the middle of a word. "Seth Curtis!" Ruth's face was as white as Fanny's, and her voice rang out like a silver bell. "Seth Curtis, you will apologize. Ask forgiveness of Fanny Foster, who is my friend and an old schoolmate, or before God and these people I will disown you as my husband and the father of my children. Fanny Foster never had an apple or a goodie in her lunch in the old school days that she didn't share it with somebody. She has never had a dollar or a joy that she hasn't divided. No one in Green Valley ever had a pain or a sorrow that she did not make it hers and try to help in some way. And in all the world there can be no more willing hands than hers." The silver voice stopped, choked with sobs, and Ruth's eyes, looking down on the shrunken, bowed figure of Green Valley's gossip, brimmed over with tears. Seth, sober now, stared at his wife, at the broken, crushed Fanny, at the crowd that stood waiting in still misery. Ruth walked down to Fanny and flung her arms about her. Fanny patted her friend's shoulders softly and tried to comfort not herself, but Ruth. There, Ruthie, don't take on so. Remember, you're nursing a baby and it might make him sick. It's all right, everything's all right, only—" Fanny's voice was dull and colorless, and she never once raised her head. "Only I wish John wouldn't hear of this. I've been such a disappointment to John without this." Though she spoke only to Ruth, everybody heard. It was the first and only favor Fanny Foster had ever asked of Green Valley, and Green Valley, as it watched Ruth lead her away, swore that if possible John should not hear. But John did hear 3 days later, and then the quiet man whose patience had made people think him a fool let loose the stored-up bitterness of years. He who in the beginning should and could have saved his girl wife with love and firmness now judged and rejected her with the terrible wrath, the cold, merciless justice of a man slow to anger or to judge. It was springtime, and Grandma, sitting in her kitchen, heard and wept for Fanny. The windows at the Foster house were open, and John talked for all the world to hear. His name had been dragged through the gutter, and he was past caring for appearances. Grandma writhed under the words that were more cruel than a lash. At the end, John Foster swore that so long as he lived he would never speak to Fanny, and Grandma shivered, for she knew John Foster. For days, not even Grandma saw Fanny. Then she saw her washing windows, scrubbing the porch steps, hanging up clothes. There came from the Foster house the whir of a sewing machine, the fragrant smell of fresh bread. The children came out with faces shining as the morning, hair as smooth as silk, shoes polished. And Grandma knew that if John Foster found a speck of dirt in his house, he would have to look for it with a microscope. But there was a kind of horror in the eyes of Fanny's children. They didn't play any more or run away, but of their own accord stayed home to fetch and carry for the strange mother who was now always there, who never sang, never spoke harshly to them, who worked bitterly from morning till night. Every spring Fanny Foster used to flit through Green Valley streets like a chattering blue jay, but now nobody saw her, only now and then at night, slinking along through the dark. And many a kindly heart ached for her, remembering how Fanny loved the sunshine and laughter. But at last the spring grew too wonderful to resist. Even Fanny's numb heart and flayed spirit was warmed with the golden heat. She had some money that she wanted to deposit in the bank for John, for Fanny was saving now as only Fanny knew how when she set her mind to it, and she had set not only her mind but her very soul on making good. Every cruel taunt had left a ghastly wound, and only work of the hardest kind could ease the hurt. Fanny walked through the streets as though she had just recovered from a long illness. Everybody who saw her hurried out to greet her and talk, but she only smiled in a pitiful sort of way and hastened on. It was nearly noon, and she wanted to avoid the midday bustle and the crowds of children. She had set out the children's dinner, but she hoped to get back before they reached home. She came out of the bank and stood on the bank steps. She looked down the streets. Nobody was about, so against her will, her eyes turned to the spot where she had been so pitilessly pilloried a month before. As then, Seth's team was standing in front of the hotel. Little Billy Evans was climbing into the big wagon. She watched the child in a kind of stupor. She knew he ought not to do that. Seth's horses were not safe for a grown-up, much less a child. She wondered where Seth was, or Billy Evans, or Hank. She wondered if she'd better have them telephone to Billy from the bank and have him get little Billy. She half turned to do that, and then out of the hotel door Jim Tumley came reeling and singing, only his voice was a maudlin screech. Little Billy had by this time gotten into the wagon, pulled the whip from its socket, and just as Jim came staggering up, touched the more nervous of the two horses with it. And then it happened. What Green Valley had been dreading for months. When men heard the commotion and turned to look, they saw Seth's horses tearing madly round the hotel corner. Little Billy Evans was rattling around in the wagon box like a cork on the water, and Fanny Foster, swaying like a reed, was hanging desperately to the horses' heads. Hank Lawley was pitching hay into the barn loft. He saw, jumped, and then lay still with a broken leg. Seth saw, and Billy Evans, and scores of other men, and they all ran madly to help. But the terrified animals waited for no man. And then from the throats of the running crowd a groan broke, for the school doors opened, and into the spring sunshine and the arms of certain death, the little first and second graders came dancing. The school building hid the danger from the children, and they did not comprehend the hoarse shouts of warning. But Fanny heard the childish laughter and the screams of horror. She knew those horses must not turn that corner. Her feet swung against the shafts. Her heel caught for a minute, and she jerked with all her might. The mad creatures swerved and dashed themselves and her against a telegraph pole. When they picked up little Billy and Fanny, they were both unconscious. One of Billy's little arms was broken, so violently had he been flung about and against the iron bars of the scat. Fanny's injuries were more serious. They took her home to her spotless house, with the children's dinner set out on the red tablecloth in the kitchen. The pussy willows the children had brought her the day before were in a vase in the center. Her husband came home and spoke to her, but she neither saw him nor heard. They gave him a blood-stained bank book with his name on it. And so she lay for days, and sometimes Doc Phillips thought she would live, and at other times he was sure she couldn't. But if she lived, he knew that she would never again flit like vagrant sunshine through Green Valley streets. She would spend the rest of her days in a wheelchair or on crutches. When they got courage finally to tell her, Fanny only smiled and said nothing. But she ate less and smiled more, and steadily grew weaker, and as steadily refused to see her husband. "No," she said quietly. There's nothing I want to see John about, and there's nothing for him to see me about any more, I guess." She smiled at the gruff old doctor. "You're about the only man I can stand the sight of, or who would put up with me." "Fanny," Doc Phillips told her, "if you don't buck up and get well, if you die on my hands, it will be the first mean thing you ever did." "Oh, well, it would be the last," laughed Fanny. "Fanny, don't you know that Seth Curtis and nearly all the town comes here at least once a day? How do you suppose John and Seth and the rest of us will feel if you just quit and go?" And then, in bitterness of heart, Fanny answered, "Oh, I'm tired of living, of being snubbed and made fun of. I'm past caring how anybody else will feel. I tell you, I'm a misfit. God never took pains to finish me. I've been a miserable failure, no good to anybody. My children will be better off without me. John said so." "My God," groaned the old doctor. "Did John say that?" He knew now no medicine that he could give, no skill of his would mend a heart bruised like that. "Yes, he said that, and a whole lot more. Said I've eternally disgraced him and dragged him down and will land him in jail or the poorhouse, and I guess maybe it's so. Only all the time he was talking, I kept thinking how he teased me to marry him. I really liked Bud Willis over in Elmwood better, in a way, than I did John, and I meant to marry Bud. He wasn't as good a boy as John, but he was so jolly, and we'd have had such a good time together that I'd never have got mixed up in any mess like this. Maybe we would have ended in the poorhouse, but we'd have had a good time going, and I bet Bud and I would have found something to laugh at even when we got there. Oh, I'm glad it's over. Don't think I'm afraid to die. I kind of hate to leave Robbie. Robbie's like me. And someday somebody'll tell him what a fool he is, like they told me. I wish I could warn him or learn him not to care. But barring Robbie, I'm not afraid to go. But I'd be afraid to live all the rest of my days on my back or in a chair. I, who was made to go. John can't abide me well and able to work. He'd hate the sight of me useless. No, sir, there's nothing nor nobody I'd sit in a chair for all the rest of my life." "Yes, there is, Peggy." John spoke from the shadowy doorway, for the dusk had fallen. "You will do it for me, girl. I'll get you the nicest chair and the prettiest crutches, and when you are tired of them, I'll carry you about in my arms, and you'll never again, I swear it, be sorry that you didn't marry Bud Willis." The spring twilight filled the room. Through it the doctor tiptoed to the door and left these two to build a new world out of the fragments and blunders of the old. End of chapter 21. Recording by Renee Moore.
Chapter 22 of Green Valley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds. Chapter 22, Before the Dawn. I wonder if Fanny's sacrifice isn't enough to drive the evil thing out of our lives and out of Green Valley forever. Seems as if everybody ought to vote the saloon out now, said Grandma Wentworth to Cynthia's son a couple of weeks later, when the whole town was celebrating because Fanny Foster had sat up for the first time in her chair that day. After all, John didn't buy Fanny her chair. Seth Curtis wanted to do it all himself, but Green Valley wouldn't let him. It was a wonderful chair. You could lower it to different heights, and it was full of all manner of attachments to make the invalid forget her helplessness. Of course, Fanny was still too weak to use these, but she knew about them and seemed pleased. Even said she believed that when she got the hang of it, she could get about the house and yard and might even venture into the streets in time. And early in the morning of the day she was to get up, Dr. Phillips drove up in his buggy with what seemed like a young garden tucked inside it. Fanny's garden and borders had been sadly neglected during her sickness. The doctor had John clean the whole thing up, and then he came with his arms and buggy full of blossoming tulips, hyacinths, and every bloom that was in flower then, and would bear transplanting. And for hours he and John worked to make a little fairyland for Fanny. My God, John, I couldn't mend her body, nobody could. But between us, we've got to mend her spirit. And the old doctor blew his nose hard to hide the trembling of his chin. But no chair, no amount of tulips and hyacinths could make up to Fanny the loss of her body. And Green Valley knew this. So Green Valley was talking more seriously than ever of driving out from among them the thing that was pushing Jim Tumley into a drunkard's grave, that was estranging hitherto happy wives and husbands, and maiming innocent men, women, and children. Little Billy was all right again, but he was now a timid youngster, and inclined to be jumpy at the sight of a smartly trotting horse. Hank Lolly's leg was healed up, but Doc said he would always limp a bit. Seth and his wife had made up, of course, but neither of them could ever efface from their hearts and memories the cruel scenes that had marred their life this past year. Seth no longer went near the saloon. He had paid dearly for his stubbornness, and would continue to pay to the end of his days. Billy Evans had swung around and was fighting the saloon now with a grimness that was terrible in one so easygoing and liberal as Billy. But nothing seemingly could convert George Hoskins, and so as long as George Hoskins was against a measure, its passage was a hopeless matter, for men like George always have a host of followers. George was a huge man whose mind worked slowly. When he first heard the talk about the town going dry, he laughed, and that was enough. No one argued the matter with him, for no one relished the thought of an argument with George. And only the minister had dared to mention Jim Tumley. In his big way, George loved little Jim, but since his wife had sickened, George spent every spare moment in her sick room, and so witnessed none of the scenes that were rousing Green Valley folks into open rebellion against the evil that enslaved them. George belonged to the old school that declared that to mind one's own business was the highest duty of man. No one in Green Valley, not even Cynthia's son, could make the huge man understand that he, in a sense, was little Jim's keeper. That since Jim could not save himself, the strong men of the community would have to do it for him. George wondered at the seriousness with which the thing was discussed. He treated it as a joke, and this attitude was doing more harm than if he had been bitterly hostile to the idea. The Civic League was counting the votes, wondering if Green Valley could ever go dry over George Hoskins' head. But Grandma Wentworth was hoping for one more miracle before Election Day. Something will happen to swing George into line. We Green Valley people have always done everything together. It would spoil things to have one half of the town fighting the other half. We must do this thing with everybody's consent or it will do no good. So let's hope for a miracle. And then the whole thing was wiped out of everybody's mind by the death of Mary Hoskins. It was over at last, and nobody but the doctor knew how hard the big man had fought for his wife's life. So nobody quite gets the bitterness of the big man's grief. But everybody had heard that Mary's last words were a plea to have little Jim sing her to her last sleep and resting place. And George had promised that Jim would sing. Jim had been drinking so steadily of late that he was a wreck. People wondered if he could sing. When they told him his sister was dead, he laughed miserably and said nothing. No one was surprised when the hour for the funeral services arrived to find Jim missing. Messengers had been sent out. They searched the town but could find no trace of Jim. For an hour, Green Valley waited in that still home. Then the undertaker from Elmwood whispered something to the crushed, terrified giant, who stood staring at the dead face of his wife like a soul in torment. Mary Hoskins left her home without the song George had promised her. At the grave there was another, a more terrible wait. My God, wait! They'll find him! God, men, wait! I can't bury her without Jim's song. I promised her. I tell you, I promised. Oh my God. It was the last thing she wanted, and I promised. So Green Valley waited with horror in its eyes and bitterness of death in its heart. As the minutes dragged, women began to sob hysterically in nervous terror. Men looked at the yawning grave, the waiting coffin, the low-dropping sun, and mumbled strange prayers. Through a mist of tears, the waiting watchers saw Hank Lolly and Billy Evans pass through the cemetery gate, dragging something between them. It was something that laughed and sobbed and gibbered horribly. Hank and Billy tried to hold the ghastly thing erect between them, but it slipped from their trembling hands and lay a twitching heap at the head of the open grave. That was Green Valley's darkest hour. And after that came the dawn. The following week, Green Valley men walked quietly to the polls, and as one man voted the horror out of their lives. The day after, little Jim went off to take the Keeley cure, and then for 2 long weeks, Green Valley was still with the stillness of exhaustion. Spring deepened and brought with it all the old gladness and a new sweet peace, a peace such as Green Valley had never known. Gardens began to bloom again, and streets rippled with the laughter of neighboring men and women. Life swung back to normal. Only the hotel stood silent, a still vacant-eyed reminder of past pain. Nobody mentioned it. Everyone tried to forget it. But so long as it stood there, a specter within its heart, Green Valley could not forget. It was said that Sam Ellis had put it up for sale. But who would buy the huge place? Then it was that Green Valley's 3 good little men came forward. Joe Gans, the socialist barber, was spokesman. He presented a plan that made Green Valley catch his breath. Why, said the 3 good little men, could not Green Valley buy the hotel for its own use? Why not remodel it? Make a community house of it? Why not move Joshua Stillman's wonderful library out of that little dark room into which it was packed and spread it out in a big sunny place with comfortable chairs and rockers and a couple of nice long reading tables? Why not fix a place for the young people to dance in and have their parties? Why not have a real assembly hall, a big enough and proper place to hold political meetings and all indoor celebrations? Why not have pool, billiards, a bowling alley? Why not have a manual training room for Hen Tomlins and his boys? Why not have a sewing room and cooking for the girls? Oh, it was a glorious plan, and Green Valley listened as a child does to a fairy tale. Of course, it couldn't really be done, many people said, but oh my, if it only could. But the 3 good little men had no sooner explained their fairy dream than things began to happen. Cynthia's son came forward with the first payment on the property. Colonel Stratton and Joshua Stillman, Reverend Campbell, offered to take care of the other payments. Jake Tuttle telephoned in from his farm that he was in on it. The Civic League offered to do all the cleaning, the furnishing, to give pictures, curtains, potted plants. The church societies offered to make money serving chicken dinners on the hotel veranda to motorists who, now that Billy Evans had a garage, came spinning along as thick as flies. Nan Ainsley's father, besides contributing to the purchasing fund, offered to provide the library furniture, the billiard and pool tables. Seth Curtis and Billy Evans not only gave money, but offered to do all the hauling. That shamed the masons and carpenters into giving their Saturday afternoons for repair work. And after them came the painters and decorators, with Bernard Rollins at their head. So in the end, every soul in Green Valley gave something, and so the dream came true, as all dreams must when men and women get together and work wholeheartedly for the common good. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Green Valley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds, Chapter 23. Fanny comes back. If only I felt the way I look. If only my feelings had been smashed too, sobbed Fanny to the doctor that first week she sat up in her chair. But I'm just the same inside that I always was, and I want to go and see and hear things. So the old doctor, who knew how much more real were the ills of the spirit than any hurts of the flesh, dropped a word here and there, and now no days passed that Fanny did not have callers, did not in some way get messages, the vagrant scraps and trifles of news that, so valueless in themselves, yet were to Fanny the lovely bits of fabric out of which she pierced a laughing tale of life. Outwardly, Fanny was changed. She was pale and quiet, and her thick, lovely hair was always smooth now and glossy and carefully dressed. It was the one thing she still could do for herself, and she did it with a pitiful care. She looked 10 years younger in a way, and her house was spick and span at 10 o'clock every morning now. From her chair she directed the children, and because in all Green Valley there was no woman who knew better how work ought to be done, it was well done. And then came the long empty hours when she sat, as she was sitting now, in her chair on the sunny side of the house, where she could look at her little sea of tulips and hyacinths and drink in their perfume. She had been trying to crochet, but had dropped her needle. It lay in the grass at her feet. She could see it, but she could not pick it up. She had not as yet acquired the skill and the inventive faculty of an invalid. And so she sat there, staring at the bit of glistening steel, as wave after wave of bitterness swept over her. Her tragedy was still so new that she could feel it with every breath. Every hour she was reminded of her loss by 1,000 little things like this crochet hook. She was forced to sit still, her busy hands idle in her lap, while spring was calling everywhere. She told herself with a mad little laugh that she would never again pick up anything. Never again would she run through her neighbors' gates, tap on their doors, and visit in their kitchens. Never again could she hurry up the spring street with the south wind caressing her cheek. No more would she gad about to learn the doings of her little world. Would it come to talk to her, to make her laugh now that she was helpless? Was she never to hear the music of the living? Was she to lose her knack of making people laugh? To lose her place in life? To live and yet be forgotten? Would she have to face that? These were some of the thoughts that were torturing poor Fanny that day. And then she gave a cry, for around the corner of the house came Nanny Ainsley, in just the same old way. Grandma Wentworth and the minister were just behind her. They stared lovingly at each other. The girl who was as lovely as life and love in springtime could make her, and the woman whom the game had broken. Then Nanny spoke, not to the broken body of Fanny Foster, but to the gypsy, springtime spirit of Fanny. I only just came home, Fanny. I went through town and saw pretty nearly everybody, and every soul tried to tell me a little something. But it's all a jumble. So, Fanny Foster, I want you to begin with Christmas Day and tell me all that's happened in Green Valley while I've been away. Never a word of her accident, never so much as a glance of pity at the wonderful chair. Just the old Nan Ainsley asking the old Fanny Foster for Green Valley news. In the scarred soul of Fanny Foster, down under the bitterness and crumbled pride, something stirred. Something that Fanny thought had died forever. Then Nanny spoke again. I have come to tell you that I am to be married to John Roger Churchill Knight. I have told no one but you and Grandma. I have promised to marry him in June, so I haven't much time to get ready. I'm hoping, Fanny, that you will come and help out." At that, of a sudden, all the old-time zest for living, the joy of seeing, hearing, and doing, surged to Fanny's very throat, and force of habit brought the words. "Oh, land alive, Nanny!" fairly gurgled the old Fanny. "Such a time as we've had in Green Valley. It was that awful cold spell after Christmas that began it. Old Man Pelly died of complications, and everybody thought Mrs. Dudley would sing hymns of praise in public. They'd fought so about their chickens. But I declare, if she didn't cry about the hardest at the funeral, and even blamed herself for aggravating him. Of course, him dying left old Mrs. Pelly alone in a big house, and her being pretty feeble, she felt that Harry and Ivy ought to come and live with her. Well, Ivy went, but she vowed that there were 2 things she would do: mother-in-law or no mother-in-law. She said she'd put as many onions in her hamburger steak and Irish stew as she pleased. You know, Mrs. Pelly can't stand onions, and she'd have a fire in the fireplace as often as the fancy struck her. Everybody thought there'd be an awful state of things, but land, now that Mrs. Pelly has gotten used to open fire, you can't drive her away from it with a stick. And she don't seem to bother her head about Ivy's cooking. And last week, she actually ate 3 helpings of hamburger steak that Ivy said was just reeking with onions. A body's never too old to learn, I suppose. There's Hendrie Rollins. Suddenly took the notion to quit smoking. Eddie'd been at him for 25 years with 20 good reasons to quit, but no. And all of a sudden, when Eddie's give up hope and not mentioned it for a couple months, he up and quits and won't even tell why. Eddie's worried. Says he's eating himself out of house and home and wants to sleep about 24 hours a day. Talking about houses makes me think that the Stockton girls are having their house painted by a man with a wooden leg. Billy Evans picked him up somewhere, and Seth Curtis was telling me how he came to lose that leg. Seems like he was prospecting somewheres in Montana, got drunk, froze it, gangrene set in, and they had to amputate. They say he's a mighty smart man, too. Maybe John will get him to paint our house when he's through with the Stocktons. Talk about physical deformities. Eva Collins has got it into her head that she's too fat entirely, and she's been dieting and rolling and taking all sorts of exercises religiously. Seems she got so set on being thin that she practices these exercises whenever she happens to think of it, and wherever she happens to be. She happened to be right under the lights 3 or 4 times, and so she smashed them, lobes and all. Bill says she'd better reduce in the barn, or else let him charge admission for a rolling performance to pay for the broken lights. So there's Eva, trying to thin off, and they say Mert Higley, swollen out of shape, having been stung almost to death by his own bees. Of course, nobody's sympathizing over much with Mert. He was so afraid of losing a swarm of bees that he forgot to be cautious. And there he is, laid out. But it isn't the bee stings that hurt him so much. Mary's been willed a good farm and a big lump of cash by some aunt that died a month ago, and hated Mert like poison. And the thing's just gone to Mary's head. She's gone into the city on regular spending sprees, and Mert's wild. He can't touch the farm, and he's afraid Mary will have that lump of money all spent before he gets out of bed. Everybody's hoping she will, and advising her to buy every blessed thing she had a hankering for, and things she's never heard of. Mrs. Brownlee The president of the Civic League even told her to buy a dishwashing machine. And heavens, if Mary didn't go right down and buy it. Doc Phillips advised her to buy herself the very best springs and mattress on the market, that it would help her back to sleep decently of nights. She's having hot water heat put in and is going to do her washing with an electric washer. Seth Curtis put her up to that. And as soon as Mert gets better, she's going visiting her sister in Colorado. She says she'll likely die of homesickness, but that she's just got to go off somewhere to get used to and learn to wear properly all new clothes she's got. Well, Mary's buying all these labor-saving machines, got the whole town thinking and spending. Dick's put in a new cash register. They say it's nice enough to have in the parlor. It made Jessie Williams buy a lot of new silver that she didn't need no more than a cat needs a matchbox. But she got it, and she gave a luncheon the other day to some of the South End crowd and tried to get just about all that silver on the table, I guess. Of course, it looked mighty nice, but when the women came to eat, they didn't know what to do with it. They got pretty miserable, all sticking to just the one knife, fork, and spoon. And Jessie got so rattled that she just about forgot to use the stuff too. And finally, old Mrs. Vingy, that Jessie asked just to have the news spread, got up mad as a hornet and marched out, saying she was too old to be insulted. Until a week ago, Bessie Williams wouldn't speak to Alex. You know, her hair's got awful white this last year, of course. Her being kind of stout, she does look older than Al. But she says that's no reason why, when a peddler comes to the door with anything, Al needs to let the man think she's his mother. Mrs. Jerry Dustin's been to see Uncle Tony's portraiture hanging in the art gallery. She says it's so lifelike it made her cry. And she's off happy about Peter. Peter's been posing for a picture for Bernard Rollins. And while he was in the studio, he got to fooling with the paints and the brushes, and lo and behold, if he didn't daub up something that looked like his mother's face when she's smiling. They say Rollins jumped, he was so surprised, and he put the boy through some paces, and swore he'd make a better artist out of him than he was himself. So there you are, and now Mrs. Dustin is dreaming of Peter in Italy, Peter in Rome, Peter everywhere in creation, and her tagging along with his brushes and dust rags. So she's happy. And Millie Sears is house cleaning like mad, for both the boys are coming home from the ends of the earth to visit, and Alice is putting off the christening of her baby boy until they come. She was here to show me the baby the other day. It's darling. Jocelyn Brownlee came with her and brought me samples of all her wedding dresses, wedding gown and all. As soon as the dressmaker's through, I'm to go over and see the whole trousseau. There, I nearly forgot the best thing. It's all about Sam Bobbins. My, here we've been all pitying Sam, and Fortune's just kicked in his door and walked in. You remember, of course, about Sam and his fighting roosters? Well, Sam went off for Thanksgiving to his sister's, and while he was gone, something ate up his prize stock. Must have been a skunk, Frank Burton says. Well, they say that Sam's heart was just about broken, not just because his stock was gone, but more because he couldn't think of another thing to turn his hand to. Well, he got through the winter some way, and then, while he was sitting in the train one day coming home, he overheard two men talking about turtles going up. Must have been two hotel men. Anyway, that gave Sam an idea, and he started right in, wading through Peterson's slough for turtles. Why, he pulled up barrels of them, and would you believe it? They sold in the city for real money. Sam went crazy, about as crazy as Mary Hagley got over her luck. And then along came the rheumatism and knocked Sam flat, just when he was doing so well. Everybody said it was just poor Sam's luck. So there was Sam sick of bed, thinking about those turtles moving off somewheres else maybe, or somebody else getting rich on them. And all the time he lay in bed groaning, Sam's wife went around the house doing the same. Only her trouble wasn't turtles, but corsets. Seems like Sam always promised Duty that if he made any money, she was to have plenty to spend. Well, he treated her mighty handsome about that turtle money. Duty had the sense to take all he gave her, and she vowed, for once in her life, she'd get herself a corset that was comfortable. Well, Nanny, heaven only knows how many brains she tried, but none of them seemed built for her. Some pinched her here and others squeezed her there, and she was as full of misery as Sam was of rheumatism. Sam finally took notice, and just to keep his mind off his own troubles, he got to watching her suffering for breath and a nice shape. Now you know Sam's always thought the world of Duty. So, one day, when she was getting ready to go to the Civic League meeting to read a paper on the best ways of getting rid of flies, and nearly crying because she couldn't get herself to look right, Sam said half jokingly, "By gum, Duty, I'll make you a corset that will fit you." Well, sir, the thing stuck in his mind and grew, and heavens to Betsy, if Sam didn't really make a corset, even helping Duty with some of the sewing. Duty wore it and took everybody's breath away. She looked so nice and could breathe without puffing and laugh as much as she pleased. The women got to talking about it and mentioned it to Mrs. Brownlee. And mind you, Mrs. Brownlee went to Sam and asked him had he patented the thing. And when he said no, she went to a woman lawyer friend of hers, and she got Sam a patent. And first thing Green Valley knew, here come 3 big corset men to town, all of them offering to buy Duty's homemade corset. So Sam Bobbins has got his fortune, and nobody's begrudging it to him. The whole town is mighty proud of Sam, I tell you. Good land, it must be 4 o'clock, for here come the children. My Nanny, but it's good to have you home again. Well, smiled Grandma, as she watched the spring twilight sift down over Green Valley that evening, I've always said that this town was full of folks who make you cry one minute and laugh the next. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Green Valley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds, Chapter 24, Home Again. It had pleaded for forgiveness and an early homecoming, that little yellow slip that Nanny Ainsley treasured so. But the bluebirds were darting through leafy bowers, and the plowed furrowed fields lay smoking in the spring sunshine before Nan came back. A week after her arrival in Scranton, the old aunt had been taken sick, and it was months before the old soul was herself again. Nan stayed through it all, but the day came when she was free to go back to the little hometown where the cloud shadows were rippling over low, dimpling hills, already gay with the gold of wild mustard and the tender blues and greens of a new glad spring. She came home one evening when Green Valley lay wrapped in a warm, thick, fragrant mist, so no one saw her step off the train straight into the arms of Cynthia's son, and nobody heard the quivering joy of his one cry at the sight of her, "Nan!" Slowly as in a dream, they walked through their fragrant misty world to where in a deep old hearth a fire sang of love and home, dreams and eternal happiness, where an armchair waited with its mate and an old clock ticked on the stairs. Oh, that first perfect hour beside his fire. He had pleaded so hard for it in all his letters. So she gave it to him, knowing that for them Both no hour could ever again be just like that. She sat and listened to the wonder of his love, then frightened at the might of it, the lovely reverence of it, crept into his arms for sweet comfort. And he held her in awe and wonder against his heart, kissed the quivering lips, and knew such joy as angels might envy. Then he took her to her father. The next day, in the shy sunshine of a perfect day, they went hand in hand to their knoll to look once more upon their valley town, and talk over all of life from the first hour of meeting. And when they satisfied the hunger for understanding the miracle that had befallen them, he told her of all that had happened in the months that she had been away, how Jim Tumley slipped beyond the love and help of them all, how Mary Hoskins grew weaker and weaker, how the Civic League struggled, and the three good little men dreamed and planned, how Fanny Foster came to pay the great price for Green Valley's salvation, how in death gentle Mary Hoskins paid too. He explained why Seth Curtis was the gentler man and why John Foster hurried home each day to laugh and talk with his crippled wife. He told her of that awful day that had crushed George Hoskins, so that he went about a broken, shrunken man, praying and searching for peace through service. It was George who'd brought the beautiful new piano to the community house, who was paying for little Jim's cure. And then because the girl he loved was sobbing over the sins and sorrows of the little town that lay in the sunshine below them, he told her about the baby boy that Hen Tomlins had gotten for Christmas, and how happy the little man was making toys for the toddler, who followed him about from morning till night. And because her eyes were still wet with tears, he laughed teasingly and said, "And I never knew that I loved you until I saw David Allen kiss his sweetheart." Of course, at that, she sat up very straight and wanted to know all about it. "I suppose you expect me to wait a whole proper year for my wedding day," he sighed a little. "I think we ought to, and I couldn't possibly be ready before then." "Do you mean to tell me that it takes a whole year to make a wedding dress?" And then the cruelty that lies in every woman made her shake her head and say, "No, that isn't why nice folks wait a whole year. They wait to give each other plenty of time to change their minds." "Nan!" And she saw then by his hurt white face that, man-grown though he was, with a genius for handling other men, he would always be a child in some things. He never would or could understand trifling in any form, having all a child's honesty and directness. And she knew that she, more than any one else, would always have the power to hurt him. "Nan," he asked slowly, "did you go to Scranton because you thought I might ask before you were ready?" She laughed tenderly. "Oh, dear heart, no. I went to Scranton because I was afraid I might propose before you were ready." But he never quite understood that, and she didn't expect him to. However, if she thought she had won, she was mistaken. The persistency in matters of love that is the heritage of all men made him say carelessly a half hour later, "Oh well, I suppose waiting a year's the best, the wise thing to do. But why must I be the only one to obey the law? Nobody else is waiting a year. All the other men are marrying their sweethearts in June. There's David and Jocelyn, Max Longman and Clara, Steve and Bonnie, Dolly Beatty and Charlie Peters. And only last week, Grandma Wentworth got a letter from out west saying some chap is coming from the very wilds to marry Carrie. He's hired the reception hall of the community house so that Carrie may have a proper wedding in case her folks refuse to give their blessing. So I'm going to marry all those chaps and then calmly go on just being engaged myself." All of a sudden, Nan saw why Seth Curtis gave in and joined the church, why Hank Lolly forgot his fears and came to the services, Why the pool room man gave up his business and was now a respected automobile man and mechanic. Why the former saloon keeper was the happy owner of a stock farm. Why Frank Burton no longer bragged about being an atheist, but went to church with Jenny. Why Mrs. Rosenwinkel no longer argued about the flatness of the earth. He was always doing this to everyone, this boy from India. Always making people see how ridiculous and petty were the man-made conventions and human notions and stubbornness when looked at in the light of common sense and sincerity. Oh, well, Nan gave with a laugh that was a half-sob. I may as well be a June bride with the rest. And now, John Roger Churchill Knight, take me down to see my town. I want to see all the new gardens, the new babies, the new spring hats and dress patterns. I want to see Ella Higgins' tulips and forget-me-nots and attend Uncle Tony's open-air meeting. I want to have an ice cream soda at Martin's and wave my hand at John Gann's while he's shaving a customer. I want to see all the store windows, especially Joe Baldwin's. I want to shake hands with Billy Evans and Hank Lolly and hug little Billy. I want to go to the post office for my mail when everybody else is getting theirs. I want to know if the bank is still there and if the bluebirds and flickers are as thick as ever in Park Lane. I want to hear Green Valley women calling to each other from their backyards and see them leaning over the fences to visit and giving each clumps of pansies and golden glow of hollyhocks. I want to see Mrs. Jerry Dustin smile and ask her when I can see Uncle Tony's portraiture at the Art Institute. I want to see the boys' bare feet kicking up the dust and their hands hitching up over their overall straps, and hear them whistling to each other and giving their high signs. I'm longing to know who had their house repainted and where the new houses are going up. But oh, most of all, I want to hear Green Valley folks say with their eyes and hands and voice, "Hello, Nanny Ainsley. When did you get back?" And my, Nanny, it's good to see you and have you come home again. So, John Roger Churchill Knight, take me down to see my hometown, Green Valley at springtime. They went down through Green Valley streets where the spring sunshine lay, warm and golden. They greeted Green Valley men and women and were greeted as only Green Valley knows how to greet those it loves. Though they said not a word, all Green Valley read their secret in their eyes, heard it in the rich, deep note of the boy's voice, in Nanny's lilting laugh. And having made the rounds, the boy and girl naturally came to Grandma Wentworth's gate. They walked through the gay front garden, followed the little gravel path around the house, and found Grandma standing among her fragrant herbs and healing grasses. They came to her hand in hand and said not a word, and Grandma raised her head and looked at them. Then her eyes filled and her lips quivered tenderly, and the two, both motherless, knew that they had a mother's blessing. It was so restful that the backyard of Grandma's, as the three sat there talking quietly and happily, and the world seemed strangely full of golden peace. End of chapter 24, End of Green Valley by Katharine Yirsa Reynolds.